Christians talk a pretty big game about loving your neighbor. I mean, that's kind of one of our things as Christians. We love our neighbor. We know that is central. That is really one of the big things that we are all about. But in practice, loving your neighbor can be really difficult. And a lot of times we think we are loving our neighbor and not at all doing that. So today on this episode, we're going to talk about how to love your neighbor. What does that look like? What is our aim? And what context does that neighborly love take place in? And to help us with this conversation today, we have Amar D. Peterman, a constructive theologian working at the intersection of faith and public life. He's the founder of Scholarship for Religion and Society, and he's the former assistant director of civic networks at Interfaith America. He holds an MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary, and he's currently a PhD student at the University of Chicago's Divinity School. And he publishes regularly on Substack with his newsletter, The Common Life. So excited for Amar to help us out today. I'm Jake Doberenz, and this is Christianity Without Compromise, a podcast for Christians who love Jesus but are tired of culture war faith. Now, let's get to rebuilding a faith that actually looks like Jesus. Well, it is fantastic to have you here, Amar. I'm really appreciative that you're on the show today discussing a topic that, like I said before the interview, really like basic Christian understanding stuff, but for some reason we need a reminder on this because we've kind of gotten off track. So thank you for being here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Very glad to be here.
So, I love to start off with stories and things. That's what we like to do in Christianity Without Compromise. So I want to begin with something personal for you. You told me that you grew up in an evangelical tradition, like many of us, that probably claim to have that kind of wide community table, come as you are, everybody's welcome kind of thing. But maybe in practice, hospitality meant something closer to assimilation. And then in Bible college, you had an experience where you really learned about that kind of welcoming. You truly encountered a space that was actually practiced what they preached, so to speak. So take us back a little bit, talk about that upbringing, and then talk about this person you encountered in Bible college that shifted a lot of your thinking for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was adopted from India as an infant. And so for folks who don't see the visual, I'm a brown American. You probably get that from my name as well. But I was raised in a white evangelical megachurch and grew up in a Polish Catholic neighborhood. And so I was caught between a public school where all my friends were going through confirmation classes and then going to the neighboring town and worshiping at a big mega church with the fog machines and flashing lights and gigantic displays and all the, things that we adorn our gym sanctuaries with. When I was in high school, I started getting really involved with that church in something of an kind of evangelical fervor, started to take my faith more seriously than I had, which is, I think, is typical for a lot of folks when you start making those decisions for yourself. Through some like random connections, ended up as an intern at that church and then worked my way up to being one of several worship leaders on staff. And so I became, I was a recognizable face. One, because the church was predominantly white and there weren't many brown or black people there.
I knew you were going to say that.
But also because they were putting me on a stage. And so I was singing in front of hundreds of people for multiple services and felt, like in kind of the evangelical rock star life as a high schooler. And that felt incredible. And at the youth groups, I'd get to preach and do things like that. But it was in this context that as I was reckoning with my own identity as a Christian, I was also gaining a more national perspective beyond the small, town of Green Bay, and had lots of questions about what was happening in the world and in the country to people who looked like me, what Jesus might say about this is as Black Lives Matter is coming up and becoming a more prominent thing, and America's kind of on the precipice of reckoning with this long legacy of racial injustice on a popular level, or a large scale. And the pastors and youth group leaders and fellow congregants didn't quite know what to do with that. Uh, they liked the diversity that I brought to the staff page and to the sanctuary stage and all of that, but didn't love the questions I was asking, or at least didn't know what to do with them. And so we, as you mentioned, we began doing things in we called it the round, where it wasn't everyone in their chair facing the stage. It was a stage in the center of this gym sanctuary,
Mm.
and so you'd all sit, and looking past the pastor you'd see the people on the other side. And I remember sitting in those moments and going, like, there's no one who looks like me. There's no one, for all these people who claim the same faith tradition that I do. Our experiences in Green Bay and our perception of the world feels so different. And those were the early questions that began to name the unbelonging that I had felt for a long time in these spaces. Uh, I still felt like a deep call to ministry and was very, very evangelical, in all the typical senses of kind of theological conservatism, to a desire to share the gospel with everyone I met, to feeling this deep call to ministry. And so I, instead of going to a state school like most of my other friends, to study a typical degree that you would after high school, I looked up Bible colleges and ended up at Moody Bible Institute, which, if folks recognize the name, it's a deeply white, deeply conservative, fundamentalist evangelical institution in the heart of downtown Chicago. And it becomes something of this bubble where this like deep conservatism feels like it's being pressured on all sides from this liberal city. And I found the opposite experience to be true, which is that when I got outside of the bounds of the institute, uh, I found people who looked like me, who were asking questions that I was asking, but sometimes didn't share the same faith as me. And so I'd hang out with South Asians who are also Muslim, and we talk about what's happening in the world. Like, why do I feel like my experience and questions resonate more with these folks who don't share a faith commitment to me, than the Christians who I go to school with and are my colleagues who do share a faith commitment with me, but hate the questions that I'm asking? A lot of this wasn't resolved, but what became a lifeline for me was the person who this book is dedicated to, which is Ashish, who is a professor at Moody, is no longer there, but was a South Asian professor who grew up in the Chicago suburbs rooting for the Bulls in the 90s. And he became a lifeline uh, by giving me the opportunity to sit in his office and ask him questions. He was the one who introduced me to the various theologians, especially in strains of liberation theology, theologies from across the globe, and not just Europe and America. And they're the things that we were told not to read, that were dangerous to read, that would pollute our minds, or, uh, completely throw off our unwavering commitment to Christ and this and that. And he said, you should read these and let's talk about them. And he, in his office, created that space of belonging, not only for me, but for the other, predominantly students who are minorities on campus,
Mm.
even students who are struggling with questions of gender and sexuality, in an institution that saw that, truly like as anathema, like expulsion, public shaming in various institutional forms. And they would sit in Ashish's office with me, and we talk about these things and try to navigate them. Uh, that was a shared table. Those, all of my questions about those things weren't resolved in that moment, but it created a space where we could talk freely and charitably with one another. And that really exemplified for me in this, tiny office that, who knows, what and who is there anymore became an early vision of what the common good might look like, not only for a classroom, but for an entire community and beyond.
Well, we appreciate you giving us a vision of that journey and all of that. And you've already kind of painted a picture of what this can become, and we'll get to that. But first, I want to dwell a little bit on kind of what has gone wrong because, you know, it's just remarkably easy for Christians to talk about loving your neighbor. I mean, in theory, like we all kind of say that, you know,
Mm-hmm.
whatever side of the spectrum you are on, like everybody's talking about that. It's on the mugs, it's in the church mission statements, kind of on the church marquee signs outside. Like everybody's talking about loving your neighbor, but not a, uh, well, you know, a lot less people are living that out. Let's just say
Yeah,
that. Then
yeah.
the people that talk about that, a lot less people living that out. Ultimately, what do you think is so hard about actually loving your neighbor and being neighborly to people and having that shared table? Why do you think that's difficult for people?
Yeah, I mean, my first thought is that it's because people are messy and complicated, and love is messy and complicated.
Oh, yeah,
It's a
yeah.
lot easier to, the idea of our neighbor and the idea of loving our neighbor is a lot more straightforward and simplistic than actually going out and doing that work. Uh, it's a challenge to encounter the reality of someone else who will often defy your own expectations of them. And so you presume that you're going to love your neighbor in a specific way, and it's not actually a way that loves them or cares for them in the way that they need to be cared for, or that they desire to be cared for. And that can be shocking, it can be frustrating, it can be discouraging. And I think a lot of folks have an idea in their mind with the best of intentions sometimes to say this person has a yard sign of someone or something I'm opposed to, but I'm going
Mm,
to love them anyways, and so I'm going to go knock on their door. And I think too, these appeals to neighbor love, that the I I don't think there's any surprise when you read the book or see anything that I write about that, like, I'm not at all on board with this administration. I'm not a Christian nationalist.
right.
Uh, Christian nationalists say that they're loving their neighbor. Who is it? Wolf, in his
Yeah.
book on Christian nationalism, appeals to neighbor love as his reasoning for being a Christian nationalist. And he says the best way that I love my neighbor is by, in one sense or another, like bringing them to Christ, whether that's like dragging them while they're kicking and screaming or
Hmm.
compelling them through, I don't think he ever says the language of like a compelling story that like invokes or raises up, affection
Hmm.
towards Christ and the church. But there are folks who say, I'm going to go love my queer neighbor, and you walk across the street, and well, loving them is telling them the gospel. That often isn't loving them at all. In fact, they
Mm.
probably do know the gospel. They may even be a Christian. And so your attempt at neighbor love does little to actually love them. And so I think one is that actually loving our neighbors challenges our assumptions about them. I think the other is that it often seems foolish in a world that's so incredibly divided and polarized to love people who don't love us back, or who even might seek our harm.
Yeah.
Uh, my mind is, for the past year or so, gone to this image of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, um, moments before he's taken by the Roman authorities. And of course, there's this scene where Judas arrives with this Roman army, uh, and a fight breaks out. And there's this moment of deep chaos, and swords are drawn, and people are fighting and battling with one another. And Jesus, uh, in the middle of all of that, bends down to pick up the ear of the one who's seeking his harm, and he heals him, and he's taken away. Uh, that is a radical practice of love in that moment. It's unique. It's not prescriptive of how I think we're to always love our neighbors. but in a moment that so much feels like this Garden of Gethsemane moment where there's fighting and chaos in the dark of night and you can't see and everything is disoriented, to recognize Jesus' presence in that moment, to be one of healing and not one of continued harm. And I think I talk in the book too about the parable of the Good Samaritan as not only uh, being neighbor love, but being stranger love and being enemy love. Um,
Mm-hmm.
to Jesus' Jewish audience, placing the Samaritan as the protagonist in the story makes his audience question not only if they can love their enemy, but if they can imagine their enemy loving them back. Um, and that, I think, too, is just a radical example of what neighbor love can do in this moment that often feels so foolish. And so I think what keeps us from truly loving our neighbors, what makes it so hard, is one, the reality of them and the challenges that that poses, but also this getting through this very, I think, natural instinct that loving someone who does not love us back is foolish, if not entirely dangerous to do.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there for sure. Um, that's exactly the kind of barriers that make it really hard to do, and it can feel like, oh, loving my neighbor isn't the most efficient, or isn't, it could harm me or something. Like a lot of real natural human fears that come up when we try to do this. Um, yeah, I like to think I'm halfway decent at loving my neighbors, but
Me too.
it's still tough to do that, especially when they're an enemy or when there's a huge difference. I know you've done a lot of like interfaith work and things like that. I mean, if we're just talking about somebody who has just a worldview that's totally different than me, it can be hard to figure that out at all. I struggle with that, even though I try to lead with curiosity and things. I'm like, you're coming at this a different direction than me. What does love look like and all of that? So, um, but I want to transition now, maybe more into the prescriptive. And you brought this up a little bit. You keep throwing around this word table. That's a big part of your book. It seems to be a big part of your whole thing. This table, this shared table. So I'm really curious what draws you to that imagery, and what do you mean when you're talking about the table in this context?
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, I say in the book that the table is the place where the common good is cultivated. Um, and the language of cultivation is really specific there, which is to say that the common good is not found, as though we need to build the ideological spaceship to go out into the stars and capture it and bring it back and implement it. Uh, it's something that's built in community. And the way that I want to imagine that is gathering across our differences around a shared table, a place where we bring the best of our traditions and beliefs and lay them out before one another and see how we can work towards a truly shared good for the whole and not just one individual part. There's a lot of reasons why I find the image of the table compelling. One is the Gospels. I think what we see in the Christian Gospels is that Jesus is always coming from, at, or going to a table. Robert Karras talks about this book. He talks about this. He has a book called "Eating Your Way Through Luke's Gospel," where he highlights how essential the table and the shared meal are to Jesus' ministry. And for me, reading that book and thinking through these examples, Jesus at a table reminds me of his humanity, and that's not to diminish his divinity and the divine work that's accomplished through the ministry of Christ. But I emphasize in the book that Jesus coming to us incarnate means that he needs food to sustain his body after days of travel. He needs water to quench his thirst after preaching for hours. He needs human fellowship to meet that deep human need for community and connection. And I think it's in this ordinary work that Christ makes his divine reality known. Of course, it's at a table that he says, this is my body broken for you, this is my blood poured out for the forgiveness of sins. the table is an ordinary space uh, that is instilled with divine significance because Jesus is present at it. And I think that's true for us today, that I talk about we join God at the table. Christians often treat the common good like a zero sum game, that if my Muslim neighbor is flourishing in some way, that inherently means I'm flourishing less than I could be. And I don't think that's true at all. I think what reveals that is joining together at the table to work together towards a shared common good. Another reason why I find the table compelling is that it's all around us. Like, I'm at a table now with my computer. I have another one over by my reading chair. I have one downstairs, in my kitchen. You go on an airplane and there's a table built into the seat in front of you. You go to a coffee shop, there's tables. You go to the library, they're everywhere. Highlighting the table as the place where the common good is cultivated means that the common good can be cultivated everywhere. The table isn't an exclusive space that we have to travel long distances to get to. It's meant to be radically accessible, radically inclusive, uh, and also radically non-possessive, in that no one gets to own the table. And that's another struggle that I think Christians have, is that we we show up, I talk about in the book, we show up to the table where the common good is cultivated, walk past our seat, grab the microphone, and pretend we're running the meeting.
Hmm.
Another layer you can add to that is that we assume that the table is placed in our church building, and everyone is coming to us in the place that we own, and that everyone is a guest at our table, instead of the challenging work, which is to, one, be a guest at another's table, or perhaps even more so, to sit at a table that we all share together and that no one gets to claim ownership of. And so, yeah, I like the image of the table, and I find it so meaningful because I think Jesus is always at tables and that God continues to always be at tables today. And two, that the table signifies that the common good is always being cultivated around us at various tables in various places, if we only will look up and see them and see it happening all around us.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that imagery very compelling, and you're right. Like, there are actually tables all around us. There are opportunities, and too often, yes, exactly to your point about, we think our churches are that space. Build it and they will come. Maybe not. Maybe not. There are tables all around us that we can cultivate that common good. Now, one of the other big points of the book is local. There's a local angle to all this. I'm really curious about this because, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I'm just tempted to think big and global. Like, there are huge, big problems going on in the world. There are issues in other countries I've never been in, I barely have heard of. Like, there's so much going on in the world. And you call us to cultivate that good. You say it all starts kind of locally. Why does that matter? What do you mean by kind of that local perspective?
Yeah, I think you nailed it, in that there's often a temptation to speak of the common good as kind of the single univocal thing that extends across space and time. Uh, but often, at least what I found, is that when people make these kind of huge claims about what the common good is, they're in one way or another really just signaling a good that is good for them or for their in group.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think you see this especially in the US, in our like deeply political climate, that politicians and pundits all the time will appeal to the common good without actually naming what it is. And that always just signals to their audience that likely agrees with them of like, oh yeah, we're all on the same page. Like, this is the common good. That's why I want the book to emphasize the deeply local work of cultivating a common good. Because as we talked about earlier, those universal appeals that we bring to the practice of neighbor love are immediately challenged by neighbors who don't fit within those assumed prescriptions of what
Sure.
the common good is. Uh, and so I think getting local reveals the inadequacies of these appeals by, yeah, confronting us with the challenge of our neighbor's good, which is often different than ours and sometimes is competing against our own good. Um, and so, yeah, those are getting local, I think, gives us an actual tangible work towards a common good that meets the needs of our neighbors versus these broad appeals that do little apart from affirm kind of what our own in groups are seeking.
Yeah, yeah, I love it. I do think it's important to think locally, to start where we are now. Maybe it would be helpful for me, for everybody, if you maybe gave us some good examples here. Like, let's think a little practically here. What does this look like? Because, on board with your message, love it. But then, what does it mean to seek that common good? What does it mean to become neighbors? Give us a more tangible picture of all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I talk about in the book that proximity is certainly one way we can define neighbors, but proximity in and of itself isn't enough to become neighbors to one another. Uh, I talk about how we need to cultivate a desire for our neighbors, a desire to love our neighbors. And so, if folks don't feel that desire or don't have that, then I think the place you begin is by reflecting and thinking through what it might mean to join with our neighbors and seeking a common good. I mean, the book opens with a question that's something like, can you imagine a world in which we become neighbors to one another? Can you imagine sitting around a shared table together and asking who's there, what food is on the table, uh, what is being discussed, what is my disposition towards the people around me? Without cultivating a desire to love our neighbors, I think we will soon find ourselves sitting in this, to extend the illustration, sitting in the farthest seat from the person speaking with our hands cupped over our ears, saying, I'm here, but not actually engaging or participating. And I think the example of Jesus is how shows us how we cultivate this love, this desire. And I think the teachings of the Christian tradition emphasize this as well, to love God and to love neighbor in such a way that we don't seek out single moments to love, but become more loving people. Don't achieve single moments of justice for ourselves, for our communities, for others, but become more just, more merciful, more compassionate people. And so the first place to begin is with reflecting and cultivating that desire to be with and for our neighbors. Beyond that, I in the book try not to get too prescriptive,
Hmm.
but intentionally so, because again, our neighbors are complicated, and your neighbors are different than mine, and they need to be loved in different ways than my neighbors need to be loved. And so that's why the desire matters, because the desire leads to relationship, and that relationship reveals how people desire to be loved themselves. At the same time, I think that the Christian tradition provides us some wonderful, tested and true practices of neighbor love. And I outline some of them in the book, and some are which you would expect: compassion and the parable of the Samaritan, lament, uh, and going through the book of Lamentations. And often lament is overlooked as something that's like on the path to loving our neighbors, but isn't actually a practice of neighbor love. But I also throw in some, I wouldn't say they're new practices. I'd say it's new language to put on continued practices. And so I emphasize Paul Farmer, who is a health practitioner who founded or co-founded Partners in Health, did incredible work in places like Haiti in bringing state-of-the-art hospitals to treat the needs of people who the broader medical community overlooked or said this is, it's failed from the start to try to provide healthcare to these folks, because look at the climate that they're in, look at their, all of the systemic things we'd have to overcome. And Farmer, in conversation with Gustavo Gutierrez, the liberation theologian, develops this practice of accompaniment, which is to say that we go on with people, not only to meet their immediate needs, but to be with them in the long run, to accompany them on their journey as a companion. So I talk about that. I talk about Hartmut Rosa, who's a sociologist, has a book on resonance, and I talk about how resonance is a practice of neighbor love, to come into tune with our neighbors, whether that's in shouts of joy or cries of sorrow. And resonance, of course, is a musical term, and talking about what it means for sounds to reverberate together in a harmonious and a beautiful way. And so I talk about things like that, and translation, that some of the like post liberals like George Lindbeck talk about Christianity as a language that we speak and need to translate to others. And so we live in this world and see it as filled with God's glory and action. Others witness the same things but don't see that. And so part of the task of neighbor love as Christians is to translate as people who are now aliens and sojourners through this world, to name and show those divine workings of God in the world, by making them known through language, and through primarily stories to the people around us who cannot yet see that. So I think there are some tried and true ways that Christians have
Uh-huh.
done this, and I try not to just rehash the same ones that we've heard countless times. I think we've all
Yeah, that's
heard
good.
one too many sermons on the Samaritan parable, but at the same time try to offer some degree of practicality without prescribing this is specifically how you're supposed to love your neighbor in this context or that context.
Yeah, I think we got to tell the truth, and that's the contexts are different, and I'd love for you to just tell me how to do it, and I could do ABC, but uh, not quite that easy. Got to sit with people, got to be with people, and figure out what how they need to be loved, how love can show up in that situation. So fantastic reminder. I do want to take some time now for you to kind of point people in the directions you want them to point to, including the book, of course. Coming out here soon, or it should be out now, mostly when people are listening to this. And so, yeah, tell us all the things and where people can read more of your work and engage more and dive in deeper with these topics.
Yeah, absolutely. The book is out March 12th. You can get it wherever you like to buy books, from your local bookstore. It's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Bookshop, all of those things. You can also get it directly from Erdman's. I have been trying to be more active on Instagram and TikTok and Threads specifically. It's kind of three different outlets to share
Mm-hmm.
different video essays that relate to this. Threads, of course, accommodates itself to more kind of short bits and pieces of things. I also write regularly on my Substack, which is just Amar D Peterman at sub.substack.com. And the Substack's called This Common Life. That was actually the initial name for the book, that was changed as we were landing on an actual title, but write about a lot of these same things about neighbor love, faith formation, and seeking the common good in various ways. So I'm active there, and those are the main things. I write pretty often for Sojourners, which is an
Mm-hmm.
online and print magazine, and so you can also find my work there. I was a columnist there for several years, and have an interesting progression of a couple years of writing there. That's always um, fun to reflect on, but have pieces there fairly regularly.
You're doing a lot, especially you're in a PhD program right now too, right? So,
I am.
um,
I am.
woo, um, best of luck, my friend. Juggling quite a bit. So, uh, thank you so much for being here. We do have one final question for you though. Before we let you out of here officially, everybody gets the same question. I'll read it as I typically read it, and I'm really curious to see what you got to say. So here's the question. As we close, leave the audience with just one practical action they can do this week to live out their faith fully for Jesus. What do you
Love
got?
your neighbor. Love your neighbor. In a way that decenters yourself. I think so often we think of neighbor love as like, how can I? It's almost as though like to love your neighbor has to like be seen, or in order for it to be for it to count towards our
Ooh.
our various merits or whatever we're, implicitly using to judge our, piety and righteousness. I think some of the most radical practices of neighbor love are on the smallest scale and no one ever sees them. But I think they're the building blocks of not only seeking the common good, but dismantling authoritarianism, defeating fascism, loving our neighbors in small, everyday ways cultivates community and humanizes us to one another. And I think in our own work of doing that, cultivates a disposition towards our neighbors, and in our neighbors receiving that, cultivates a shared love for us. The systems and powers that want to divide us hate that so much.
Yeah.
And so finding ways to do that, I think, is a wonderful way to faithfully live for Christ, and for our neighbors as we truly seek what is good for them and for the good of our whole community.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Big fan of that message. I just preached on Ruth not very long ago, made a similar point and said, look at all these people just doing some kindness, just doing a little bit of neighborly love, and look at the legacy that leaves. Like, we don't all need to start nonprofits or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Just start small. Do those things that maybe not everybody sees. That is great, and that is faithful and beautiful, and that can start to dismantle a lot of the really bad stuff in the world. So thank you so much, Amar D. Peterman. Thank you tons for being on Christianity Without Compromise. Super duper appreciate you. Before you go, I always want to recommend to people the kind of person to share this episode with. And so today, I mean, who needs to know a little bit more about being neighborly? Not to say they're a bad neighbor, but just who needs to hear this message of the kind of small things, the staying local. Who needs to hear this message? Think of somebody in mind. You probably have somebody, maybe a literal neighbor, that you can share this with and discuss the episode with. Share this out, and then of course get the book Becoming Neighbors. Do all those things after listening to this episode, and both of us would appreciate that greatly. So thank you to the audience, and thank you, Amar, to you for being on today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
This episode of Christianity Without Compromise was hosted by me, Jake Doberenz, and produced by Theophany Media, my podcast production company. If this conversation served you, please rate and review the show and share it with a friend and help others find it. You can also subscribe at jakedoberenz.substack.com to get email updates with new episodes every Tuesday and my often humorous theological reflections on Fridays. And as always, don't just listen, live it. Live out that Christianity without compromise. Thanks for listening.